Thank you so much, Cheryl, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our second webinar of National Campus Safety Awareness Month this year. We are really excited to continue to bring you some programming that is supporting our theme of bridging the gap between theory and practice this year for National Campus Safety Awareness Month. And we are joined today by Holly Reiter-Milkovich from EverFi, as Cheryl indicated, who's going to help us walk through thinking about using the data that we gain from all of the research that we do on campus to collect perspectives and feedback on how we're doing around campus safety type work and prevention work, and how we can use that data to actually create change on our campus, and how we can communicate with our campus community about that change that we're making. As we know that sometimes our campus community members just don't have a great idea of all the work that we're doing because we are not always making time to accurately and adequately explain those efforts to them. So today's webinar is a chance to kind of think through how we are already communicating about the work that we're doing or changes that we're making, how we're using data to best inform those practices, and then how we're sharing that information with each of the constituents at our campus, so students, faculty, staff, and administrators as well. And so I am Laura, like Cheryl said. My role at Clery is Senior Director of Programs, and I've been here for 4 years. My background is in counseling, school counseling, so I was a school counselor at an elementary school in Philadelphia for 3 years before entering the world of higher education. I like to joke that college students are just taller middle school students, so it was a helpful transition for me. But I spent some time working in both residence life and student conduct roles before joining Clery Center. And so my philosophy and perspective is always driven by centering students, and I've spent a lot of experience working with campus safety professionals and prevention and response administrators on campuses, as you'll probably see reflected in a lot of the responses I provide in all of the webinars that we do. I'd love to give our co-presenters a chance to introduce themselves as well to you all today. So can we start with our Executive Director, Jessica Mertz?
Hello, thank you. So I'm excited to be joining my first Clery webinar as the Executive Director, and I appreciate Laura generously calling me a co-presenter, although I'll be mostly just sort of jumping in and here supporting today. But I just came on board as the Executive Director in May, about 4 months in now, and was previously at the University of Pennsylvania for about 10 years, running their prevention programming and response programming for sexual violence, relationship violence, and stalking. So it's been a pleasure to join the Clery team and to be on another side of things, but I'm particularly excited and invested in this conversation today because, like, as I'm sure a lot of you can relate to who are on campuses, I had a very sort of love-hate relationship with data, with its importance of how to collect it, what to do with it, and often felt like I was sitting on a lot of important data that I really didn't know what to do with. So I'm hoping that this conversation today can help you all work through that and figure out how, especially Clery data, could be something that's potentially more useful for you, especially for folks doing the prevention and response work. So very happy to be here and to join Holly and Laura.
Thanks so much, Jess. And yes, I didn't want to steal your thunder, so I'm glad that you mentioned it because I was going to if you didn't, but it is so exciting to have you on your first webinar as our Executive Director, and I'm really glad to be on it with you today. And please don't diminish your contributions are so important no matter how much you jump in or out. Holly, would you please take some time to introduce yourself? Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this year, as EverFi has always been a constant supporter of NACFAM with Clery, and we're really excited to have you here again this year.
Thank you so much, Laura, and I'm really super excited to be on this call. I have to say, Jessica, I am hoping that potentially by the end of this webinar that some folks who, like you, potentially share a love-hate relationship may be able to transform that to a love-like relationship or maybe even a love-love relationship. So my role at EverFi is as the Senior Director of Impact in Education, focusing specifically on sexual and gender-based violence prevention. So for those of you who may be less familiar with EverFi, we are a digital education company that serves not only higher ed, but also students in the K-12 schools, as well as corporations, and really seeking to address some of the biggest challenges that our world faces, from everything from financial literacy and financial education to sexual harassment in the workplace, to decreasing summer learning loss, to increasing the diversity and inclusivity efforts for corporations. And then in the higher education world, we are really proud to work with over 1,500 campuses and reach 5 million learners, addressing issues that we're going to talk about today, certainly related to sexual and gender-based violence prevention, alcohol and other drug misuse prevention, as well as those interrelated issues that, when our students bring their whole selves, they also are bringing issues related to mental well-being and resiliency, as well as, those critical issues related to diversity and inclusion. So that whole ecosystem of the whole student is what we seek to address at EverFi, and both through our courses and then through the thought leadership, some of which I hope to share today with you as it relates to our Campus Prevention Network. So I'm excited about a really amazing conversation over the next 80 minutes or so, and just want to thank everyone for taking time out of a very busy beginning of school season to be able to join us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Holly. And we are also looking forward to hearing about those things. I loved your analogy there. If you heard my giggling between a love-hate moving to a love-like, love-love relationship. I think that is a fantastic goal for today, and I wish I had thought to include it in this slide. But our more staid goals here for everybody today are to increase our ability to effectively interpret data to hopefully make changes in prevention and response efforts. We're going to walk through some strategies that you can incorporate as soon as this year into how you analyze information from various data sources, and then how you can put those learnings or those that information that you yield into practice, and then how you can communicate with your campus about the changes that you're making and how those changes are influenced by data. So for our part, what Clery Center hopes to impart in this conversation today, in addition to what Holly's going to share with you about some strategies and techniques to use, is the data sources that exist under Clery, and then how you can use the information gained from those areas in making informed decisions around changes to your campus safety and prevention and response efforts. So for those of you that don't know, the Clery Act is a federal campus safety law that requires certain elements of transparency and accountability between institutions of higher education and its consumers, which would be students that attend there and staff members, employees that work at those institutions. And within many other areas, amongst other requirements, the Clery Act does ask that institutions that receive federal funding, so those would be schools that would be required to comply with Clery, in an annual capacity, publish a document that's called an annual security report. That report is due each year by October 1st, so it is a very timely thing to discuss right now at this point in the year. And that report should include both Clery Act crime statistics, as well as summaries of existing policies and procedures, referred to as policy statements, on certain areas of campus safety. And so for our part today, we're going to talk a little bit about Clery Act crime statistics and what they do and do not represent. But a simple formula to keep in mind is that Clery Act crimes statistics, are a reflection of Clery crimes that occur within Clery geography that are reported to a CSA. So a Clery statistic is a very specific data point. It is a Clery crime, so an incident that aligns with the definition of the Clery crime under the Clery Act, that took place within Clery geography. Clery geography is a Clery-defined set of geographic locations that are related to a campus. There are 4 different categories, 3 of which are more easily understood than probably the 4th, which is a little bit less easy to understand, but we're just not going to spend time going through those geographic categories per se today. But it's important to understand how that relates to the statistic. So again, Clery crimes that occur within Clery geography reported to a campus security authority are Clery crime statistics. And they are cataloged each year in an institution's annual security report and are reported directly to the Department of Education each year as well. Additionally, the Clery Act requires that institutions that have a public safety department or a campus police department that they maintain a daily crime log. A daily crime log should reflect all incidents of crime that are reported to that campus safety office or campus police department that occur within the campus's patrol jurisdiction. And so the incidents do not need to be Clery crimes per se. As you can see, they don't need to necessarily take place within Clery geographic locations. They just need to take place within the campus's patrol jurisdiction. And so those reports are logged in this daily crime log, which is available for public inspection every day. And so, excuse me, in addition to those Clery-related data sources, on a campus there are certainly other types of sources of information that are gained by either a focused intervention, like running something like a campus climate survey, or it could be through more casual means of collecting information, which a focus group could be perceived as either way, I would suppose. And then you could also conduct things like an online evaluation or a needs assessment or a satisfaction survey of either students or staff to get information about a certain topic area or about a certain aspect of campus life. And so all of these types of data sources on this slide are not necessarily directly connected to reported incidents. They are more a reflection of what the people that are answering that survey in the moment are willing to share, and that would account for the knowledge that they have about whatever the topic is that's being asked or addressed. The Clery-related data is a little bit more concentrated and focused in that it is obviously information that has been reported to the campus, but that meets certain criteria. And so that's what's reflected in both those annual security report, Clery crime statistics, and in the daily crime log. And so we kind of compare and contrast those two types of on-campus data sources in the next couple of slides, just to give you a little bit more clarity on what each of them measures, because we think a common area where folks can easily get confused around how to use data is a lack of understanding of the fullness of what that particular data set represents. And so for us, for our campus climate surveys, there's a distinction between this idea of prevalence rates and reported incidents per se. And so a campus climate survey is yielding responses that people feel comfortable sharing in that moment, and it's not necessarily connected to whether or not they reported that information in any other capacity. They very well might not have, they very well could have. But the information that's gleaned from a campus climate survey is not necessarily the same as what is gained from Clery Act crime statistics. And that's just an important distinction to make, because this is one of those areas where you end up talking about things like, apples and oranges, like that. This would be one of those times. Clery Act crime statistics might be apples, and the information gained from a campus climate survey about incident rates might be oranges. In addition to that, I would love to invite Jess to kind of talk about her experience using campus climate surveys and her thoughts on what they provide in terms of value and information in a campus setting.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I would imagine that there's some people on the call right now who are anxiously awaiting the release of the AAU Campus Climate Survey, which I thought would be out by the end of September. I don't know if anyone has any updated information about when that's coming out, but when I was at University of Pennsylvania, we participated in the last AAU survey, and when that data was released in 2015, it was really a learning experience for us to figure out, what do we do with this wealth of information we have all of a sudden about prevalence and experiences of students on campus, and how do we make sense of how this differs from the numbers that we're seeing in our Clery data? And at first it felt like they were in conflict with each other, and I think often students saw them as being in conflict with each other. And I know Holly will talk a little bit more about how to sort of use numbers and data to tell a better story, but the more I sort of sat with the AAU survey statistics, the more I thought about it really as just sort of complementing our Clery data, thinking of it as sort of telling a story that the Clery numbers couldn't tell. So for example, the AAU survey would ask questions about, why folks would choose not to make a report, or who they would report to, and would, I know last time I think it was ranging from 5% to 28% of students said that they did not report to any campus officials or law enforcement. Now that's something that those of us in the field were not surprised to see, right? We've known for a long time that it is one of the most underreported crimes. But just having that to then explain to folks why we might not be seeing our Clery numbers fully represent the experiences that students were having. So thinking about how those two can sort of connect to each other. Or even questions in our AAU survey that would ask, why students didn't report, and them explaining that they felt like it was not serious enough, right, that it did not rise to the level of making a report. And so you could see how that would then be a disconnect between students explaining or sharing their experience with a CSA or campus security authority. So I think trying to figure out how they complement each other. And as Laura said, what's really interesting to me is this climate survey. These climate surveys really do capture a moment in time, right? And ideally, you're doing them regularly, whether it's annually or biannually or every 4 years. So you're getting comparable data, but they're still just capturing a moment in time of what students are reporting, whereas the Clery numbers are ongoing, right? This is a constant collection of data, which in some ways makes it harder to figure out what to do with it. But I think the two of those things together, we really just need to think about how we can do a better job of connecting them and using them all to tell a story.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jess. There was a helpful question that came through around what AAU stands for, and so that is the Association of American Universities. And as Jess was indicating, they conducted a national campus climate survey back in 2015 and shared in June of 2018 that they're replicating that again this year in 2019, 4 years later. And so we are still awaiting the most recent results from that second set of data. But one thing that Jess pointed out that is helpful to acknowledge here too is that discrepancy between students saying that they report something and then also how that lines up with the records of reports in annual security reports. This was one element of the AAU survey that was analyzed by the Bureau of Justice Statistics back in 2015, whereas even students that are saying that they did report, that number didn't line up with the actual number of reported instances of those types of crimes in the ASRs that were evaluated and analyzed by the folks that did the survey. So there is still definitely discrepancy around what can be reported, why people choose to report or not report, and what they think reporting means. I actually just uploaded a document that I apologize I didn't upload sooner through that files pod that all attendees should have access to. It's a document called Understanding Clery Statistics that Clery Center published back in 2016 in response to the findings of the AAU survey from 2015 that uses information from that survey to help draw distinctions between what Clery data represents and what the AAU survey revealed. And so we would hope to update this information with the 2019 information once that comes forward as well. So look for something similar perhaps in 2020 from us, but thought it would be helpful to, even though it's a little bit dated, to still provide that information to you.
And I'll also share in the chat box, Laura, sorry, I'll share the link to the results from the AAU survey from 2015, because if folks haven't looked at it, I do think it's a really good resource to check out.
Yes, thank you so much, Jess. That's super helpful. And so when we think back to then the Clery crime statistics, and just to be clear too, when I say Clery Act crime statistics, in case folks are not as familiar, the Clery Act does dictate certain crimes for which campuses are responsible for reporting statistics on. So the crimes are broken down into 4 categories. We have a couple of different resources that we can include in the files pod that generally summarizes the Clery Act in those areas. But the Clery Act does call out certain crimes that campuses are responsible for reporting information in the form of statistics on. And those crimes range from, criminal homicide, sex offenses, ag assault, robbery, burglary, all the way to dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking and hate crimes as well. And so there isn't enough time in today's webinar to get into all of the crimes independently, but just know that there are required areas for which campuses are responsible for reporting information. And so, as I said earlier, that is distinct from the campus climate survey, which could be a range of behaviors that are reported on, as well as the connection and the story that Jess is referring to around why people do or do not report. Do they feel safe reporting at that campus? What does safety mean to them? What other resources would they want to have access to, et cetera? And so for Clery crime statistics, again, this is that relationship or that formula. They are reports of Clery crimes that occur within Clery geography that are reported to a CSA. And they capture information reported throughout, and I put the academic year here, but truly what I mean is any time that folks are coming forward with an information, because Clery statistics are actually reported and captured in the calendar year. So when you open up an ASR for 2019, the one that's due by October 1st, you'll see statistics from the past 3 calendar years, so from 2016, 2017, and 2018. But they do capture information that's reported throughout the year. They just are categorized per calendar year. That information is published in the ASR, also needs to be reported directly to the Department of Education each year. And so for those reasons, we think of this as maybe providing a picture of trends, or we can look across those 3 years in an ASR and see fluctuations in reporting numbers or things like that. And so using that information to guide decision making is really important. And after Holly talks through how to approach that concept, we'll circle back around at the end and talk through how to use Clery data and information in particular to think and strategize through responses and problem solving, or maybe changes in your prevention or response methods. So now I'm going to turn it over to Holly, who's going to walk through her content around how to best use data to make those kinds of decisions, and then how to communicate about the decisions or changes that you make. Thanks so much, Holly.
Oh, thank you so much. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about your Clery data is that it sets a benchmark and a standard for data transparency. And that is, if I wanted to make sure that you went home with any one message, is that it is really important to be as transparent as you can on your campus with the information about these really critical health and safety issues. So we're going to be looking at a number of ways to make that data transparent and to engage the community. But we would be remiss not to know, just how important that is. And that's not only, of course, to support some of the consumer information drivers that are a part of the Clery Act, but also as an important feature for building trust within communities, and for making sure that when we are talking about these important issues of both prevention and response, that everyone in the community has as much an opportunity as possible to be equally informed on these issues. Now, certainly not all information, not all data is appropriate for all audiences, but what I would encourage all of us to do is really to lean into transparency. And I'm going to actually in just a few slides be sharing a few examples of some pretty amazing, pretty radical transparency opportunities, especially related to those campus climate surveys. But we always here at EverFi, when we're talking about these issues, want to start our conversation in thinking about a comprehensive framework for prevention. So we're going to really be focusing in on data, how we're using data, but that is a part of a comprehensive approach that really starts with a foundation of institutionalization, as you can see here on the bottom of the slide, and that is, really focusing in on what are those institution drivers that create stable, ongoing support for any kind of prevention or cultural transformation efforts. So, our senior leaders talking about this issue publicly and also internally as well. We know that voices of presidents make a huge difference in whether or not resources related to personnel time, resources related to dollars are devoted to these issues. Also that there's an opportunity and an expectation that there is system-wide buy-in on the importance of prevention and real commitment to engaging in those prevention efforts, that it's not just housed in, with the 1, 2, 3 FTE who have prevention as a part of their job titles, or are only in the health centers or sexual assault prevention areas, but really reach across to the academic side of the house and even to some of our business operations as well. So that's institutionalization. We're going to be focusing today on, critical processes. And a prevention girl isn't supposed to have favorites, but this might be my favorite area to talk about, because these critical processes that we're going to be talking about, how we use data, how we gather evidence to make informed decisions about what kinds of prevention approaches we're going to implement on campuses, really is those pieces that take the commitment and the support from institutionalization and translate it into those effective policies and programs. Policies, of course, really help us shape the framework and the expectations and the values of institutions, and support accountability so that we know that prevention efforts are being administered in ways that make sense, and that our policy framework supports the values of our institution. And then all of that then bubbles up to the programming, which is in fact what a lot of people think prevention only is. And these are those interventions, be it individual one-on-one training, in-person training, certainly online education efforts fall here, poster campaigns, and other kinds of efforts that seek to change attitudes and behaviors. So we're going to be focusing on critical processes, but I wanted to make sure that we were thinking about it within this larger framework of prevention. All right, and then the other thing, when we're talking about data and we're talking about assessment or evaluation, I just want to reflect the fact that this can feel like a little bit of gobbledygook to some folks. What do we mean when we're talking about assessment? What do we mean when we're talking about evaluation? And what counts as data? This is, of course, a topic that my husband can attest I can spend hours talking about, but I just want to hone in on a couple of specific pieces. We're going to be talking a lot today about issues related to diagnostic assessment, and certainly looking at the Clery data that's reported in the annual security reports is an important part of that data picture, and a worthwhile place to spend quite a bit of time as we are today. But as we're looking at a diagnostic assessment, fundamentally what we're seeking to do is figure out what the problem is. And I love this quote from Malcolm Forbes, who reminds us that it's so much easier to suggest solutions when you don't know too much about the problem. And too often, very well-intended and well-meaning internal or external stakeholders on college campuses bring forward solutions in the form of speakers who they may want to bring to campus, or programs that they heard are working really well on another campus, or other kinds of efforts that don't directly relate to a specific problem that might be happening on your campus, or that are being suggested in a vacuum of data. So, when we're looking at diagnostic assessments, we're really looking at understanding what are the specific problems on a campus are, because while we know that a lot of the issues that we're addressing impact all campuses, we also know that they impact campuses differently, and we'll get into a little bit of research at what some campus-level factors are that can make differences between the ways in which issues impact individual institutions differently. But when you're thinking about those diagnostic assessments, or gathering information to be able to identify what the problems are, and especially what the problems are that you're going to address, of course, campus climate surveys that we've already talked about, and the Clery data that we've already begun to talk about are very important resources. But there also, of course, is data from online courses that you may be delivering to your campus populations. Certainly if you are doing an online course, we would hope that any online course that you would be doing would have the ability to gather data about students' perceptions, behaviors, experiences prior to their arrival on campus if you're delivering it pre-matriculation, or as more and more campuses are doing, if you're delivering those online education programs to your second, third, fourth year students, that's gathering information as well. That's a very powerful set of data, potential data to be able to include in those diagnostic assessments. And, beyond that, thinking about other kinds of measures, such as, if you have a relationship with your local hospital, asking about hospitalization or transportation records for students related to specific forms of harm can be an additional data source. Looking at those, the conduct reports, looking at, the kinds of reports that are happening, where they are happening, what time of year they are happening, all of those can be a part of those diagnostic assessments. Moving then to formative assessments, and we're going to spend a little less time here, but I did want to make sure that I at least spoke to it for a minute. To note that those formative evaluations and formative assessments are really about trying to figure out, once you know what the problem is, whether or not the kind of effort that you're considering implementing, or the intervention that you're contemplating, or the policy change that you're contemplating, makes sense for your community. So thinking about whether or not you have the capacity to be able to address it, whether or not the intervention that you're considering is appropriate to the stage of readiness for your campus community, if the language of the intervention is appropriate to your campus. All of those kinds of issues are ones that are addressed as a part of a formative assessment, as you're determining what it makes sense to implement on your campus. And this is really a place where it can be helpful to hold some key stakeholder interviews with those stakeholders both inside and outside of your campus. This can be a time to assess the political palatability of specific interventions, which is, for me, in my time at the University of Michigan, where I was for 8+ years, a very important early part of the conversation, because, no matter how amazing an intervention might be, if I wasn't assured that there was, the ability of the institution to full-throated endorse this kind of approach, it wasn't going to be able to be instituted on our campus. And I know that for those of you who are on the line, that's a familiar scenario. But focus groups also with those individuals for whom the intervention is intended, or for whom the intervention is targeted, is another appropriate point. And also focus groups with those who would be implementing the intervention as well, to make sure that it is the right approach for them. And then, this is a place for something like, for example, a SWOT analysis, where you're assessing some of the strengths that you're bringing to the prevention table, as well as some of the opportunities that you have to strengthen those issues. All right, so I promised you a radical transparency approach, and I'm really excited to share this example from Centre College. So Centre College was one of EverFi's Campus Prevention Network Impact Award winners for 2019. And what that means is that based on our diagnostic assessments that EverFi makes available to all colleges and universities in the country, Centre College scored in the top 5% of colleges and universities who have completed that diagnostic inventory. And they really are bringing a best practice approach to sexual assault prevention. One of those best practice approaches was the way in which Centre College engaged their community around their campus climate surveys. So what you see here on the screen is actually the, it looks a little self-serving because there's a picture of me right there, but let me explain what the context of that picture is, which is that it's a newspaper article following a campus-wide colloquium event that Centre College held to share their campus climate survey results. Now, there are some contextual issues that make this possible for Centre College, which can be a constraint for other campuses, which is that it is a small liberal arts institution. It's largely residential. They have a long-standing colloquium series, and it is in the institutional value system and expectations that many, many, many students, if not most students, are going to attend these colloquiums. But Centre College was particularly invested in sharing the outcomes of their campus climate survey in a very public and broad approach, because there had been some concern coming from their students related to some of the findings from that campus climate survey. And so Centre College invited me and another colleague. The person that you see there is also Kara Tuttle-Bell from Vanderbilt University, to help the institution analyze and provide additional context to some of the outcomes from their campus climate survey. We shared all of these outcomes from the campus climate survey, or all of the outcomes that were able to be shared based on the N size, in the largest auditorium on their campus in real time, up on the big screen, in front of their president, who introduced the entire session, their Title IX coordinator, their vice president for student life, and many other members of their senior administration who were also present to see this information as well. And after those findings were shared, we actually invited in real time for students in the audience to think about what we had just shared and to provide ideas that they had about how Centre College can move forward with these examples. Now, if you can imagine unleashing through 700 students' cell phones the opportunity to share their ideas in rolling live time up on a big screen was something that we all held our breath to see what would happen. But we actually put some pieces in place that made that more likely to be successful, and that's what I'm going to share with you next. What we did was borrow a strategy from a resource called Liberating Structures. You can see the website in the corner there. It's free to use. I encourage you to go to liberatingstructures.com and see some of the ways in which they seek to engage audiences. But the project, the way in which we framed the interaction is called the 1, 2, 4 all. And this is a great way to gather information from large groups, allow for these groups to be able to consider these issues singularly or in self-reflection, share it with others, and then refine their ideas in small groups before sharing them more broadly. This is a great way to help a community, a group of students, transition from hearing information or from getting results into an action planning, now what do we do with this information phase, that piece that Jessica was talking about earlier where, gosh, now we have all this data, what do we do with it? If campus administrators are feeling that, that is absolutely what students and faculty and staff are feeling as well. And so it's really important to create ways that once the information is shared, that the community has an opportunity to weigh in on what some of their ideas are about these issues. So I'm going to show you how this is set up in just a minute, but I wanted to share these strategies for success, that you want to make sure that there is a process of self-reflection, and you want to enforce those time limits. So making people think before they talk is generally a great idea and absolutely essential as a part of this activity. Enforce those time limits. You want to make sure that you keep folks moving along, and you are going to defer judgment to the extent possible. And that this is really about collecting ideas. So you're going to be collecting ideas, not making promises about what an institution is going to do or is not going to do, but making sure that you're creating the space in the forum to collect the ideas about that experience. And if you do this live, so we used a poll everywhere as a part of this project, you will automatically be gathering all of the ideas that students are going to share. And this is how we framed it. So we asked students, what opportunities do you see for making progress on these climate challenges? And we had 2 other questions as well, but this was the first question. And you can see here that it started with a minute of self-reflection, then it went to groups of 2, and then groups of 4, and then after those 4 minutes, those groups of 4 together put their big screen share ideas up that rolled onto the big screen. So this is one way that you can really lean into that radical transparency. Now I'm going to share with you an example from Williams College, which is again, a small liberal arts college in western Massachusetts, about how they're using a novel approach to gather more information to supplement some of the data that is coming from their Clery data as well as their campus climate survey data through what we called was a mapping approach to really frame new strategies related to environmental or situational prevention. Now, I'll note that situational prevention really springs from the foundation of a public health approach, and certainly our colleagues in alcohol and other drug harm prevention have used environmental management approaches for a long time. But it also has some roots in both in the criminology world and the social justice world. And the upshot of an environmental or a situational prevention approach is that you're seeking to change the environment so that individuals are more likely automatically, because of environmental cues or structures, make healthier, safer, more respectful decisions related to their behavior. So that's really the foundation of situational prevention. And Williams College took some data that they had already had from their campus climate survey. So they had done this diagnostic data that said, gosh, we've got high rates of unwanted touching in campus event spaces. And they also knew that there was a specific context for this, that the Williamstown, where Williams College is located, is a pretty isolated campus within the Berkshire Mountains, and there are very few places off campus for students to socialize. So most of the students, the socializing of all kinds happens in campus spaces. So this is an opportunity for the team at Williams College to be making decisions about how they frame those spaces to help address this issue of unwanted touching. And so the work that I'm going to be sharing with you is really the brilliance of Meg Bassong, who is the director of their sexual violence prevention and response efforts there. And what Meg Bassong developed in coordination with a number of other professionals as a part of the Department of Justice grant was a mapping strategy, and she asked for hundreds of students to take maps of the social spaces that they had a lot of their major campus events in, and using stickers map how they felt about those specific spaces, whether or not the kinds of interactions that they were having along a number of different factors were positive or negative. So looking at noise levels, certainly looking at touch, but also looking at the ways in which a person might be feeling as though they're being gazed upon, or whether sight lines are being obstructed, looking at light levels. So all of those kinds of environmental factors, she asked hundreds of students to map out on these specific campus spaces. So this gives you an example of one of the maps that that Meg's students created, and you can see how they really mapped out these specific spaces and gathered much more data about how students are interacting on those campus spaces. They then used that data to be able to inform a number of different interventions related to space. So they learned, for example, that when students can't hear each other on the dance floor, they feel a lot less safe, and they also feel isolated from their friends. And so they were able to institute decibel level policies for their campus-wide events to help to maintain a fun party environment, but also be able for students to be able to hear each other. They also changed some of the lighting and the ways in which students ingress and egress from the space. And they implemented a coat check. So these are just some of the examples of the ways in which they took that campus-level data that's related to these this issue of unwanted touching to make environmental changes so that students' behavior is cued to be more respectful and to be more aligned with the values of Williams College as well as its policies. So what you're seeing here now is, some more information about why it's so important to be thinking about the campus level. So our campus climate data does gather a lot of really powerful data related to prevalence at the individual experience level. And that those specific prevalence rates can help roll up to more campus-wide data that relates to ways in which your campus may be more vulnerable to, for example, in this instance, higher rates of victimization of sexual assault. So I'm really delighted to share this hot off the presses research from Dr. Clery Moylan at Michigan State University. So this is forthcoming in the Journal of the Society for Social Work and Research. And Dr. Moylan and her colleagues asked the question of why is it that whereas all campuses are experiencing high rates of sexual assault, some campuses are experiencing higher rates of sexual assault than others. And using ACHA data across 473 campuses, this is what they identified, is that those campuses with higher levels of binge drinking and those campuses where there's a higher proportion of students reporting experiences of discrimination, those campuses were also much more likely to have higher rates of sexual assault. These were risk factors for sexual assault. So thinking about your own campus data and looking at for example, your campus climate data in isolation may not share all of what you need to know about your campus. That you also want to be looking at these other kinds of data that indicate other forms of of harms that students are experiencing on your institution. I want to point out here this higher percentage of sexual and gender minority students on campus. This is a campus level risk factor. Now, we don't want to imply in any way that a strategy for reducing your risks on campus would be to in any way not welcome these students onto campus. What we want the message to be around noting that when there are more students who are identifying as sexual and gender minority students on campus tells us is that this is an opportunity to increase the inclusivity and the of gender and sexual minority students on campus into your broader campus community. So what campus climate survey after campus climate survey reveals is that these sexual and gender minority students are at strikingly increased rates, experiencing strikingly increased rates of sexual and gender-based violence on your campus. They're also more likely to be coming into campus already having experienced violence, which makes them even more at risk. So one approach is to increase the resiliency and the self-protection strategies of those sexual and gender minority students, and that's an important approach. Dr. Robert Coulter's research out of the University of Pittsburgh reminds us that an equally powerful, and I would say approach that should always, I would say, be paired with increasing students' protective factors is to increase the likelihood that those students are going to be accepted by the larger student population, so that we're facing our efforts outward as well as inward on that information. Once you have all of that information, how do you communicate it effectively to your campus population and to other stakeholders externally as well, your parents, your alumni, the media, the community in which your institution is situated? I would be remiss not to draw your attention to this resource from the Berkeley Media Studies group. I've shared the link on the bottom. It is fantastic reading, and it really offers a formula that they have derived from 10 years of research on effective messaging related to sexual and gender-based violence. And that effective message, how we share information about data, can make such a difference as to whether or not there is acceptance in the community and whether or not the prevention efforts that you put in place are effective, are embraced, and are moved forward by the institution, and are supported. So you want to make sure that you are evoking shared values of the institution and of that community that you're speaking to. So, those shared values are often really foundational in the mission of your institution, that we want to be preparing students to be global citizens and leaders, to generate new knowledge, to have affirming positive experiences in their community, and to have meaningful relationships moving forward. It's important that when you're talking about prevention that you recognize that the data that you're sharing can often feel very difficult, and that there are negative feelings associated with that data. So we don't want to brush over those negative feelings, or that reading about this data can feel discouraging. Acknowledging that that is true for many, and it may be true for the speaker of the message, is an important part. You want to then, after you've acknowledged those negative feelings about that some may have about the data or the way in which it reflects pretty difficult experiences that students have had on campus, you want to talk about how it is that you're now going to take this information that you have and move forward, what the problem is exactly that you're going to be tackling, and how you're intending to do it. And then I would note one additional piece is how you're going to continue to let your campus community know about these issues. So I want to share one institution's approach to this kind of communication strategy. So I'm remiss to have not shared the Tulane University logo on this first slide. It does come on the second one, but this is work from Tulane University, the amazing work of Dr. Meredith Smith, who is their Title IX coordinator. And they did a campus climate survey in 2017. And as a part of that campus climate survey, I want to lay out for you how they communicated about the climate survey, and very importantly, what they are going to do in follow-up to that campus climate survey. So you can see that they introduced their climate survey with a communication from the president in late September that talked about the importance of this survey, how committed the institution is to sexual assault prevention, and asking individuals to take part in that survey. They then had a communication related to the survey launch. And then between the survey launch and the close of the survey, they continued to communicate with their campus constituency, sharing updates about how many individuals had participated, what, if any, early insights they were beginning to see from the data. All of this builds trust for the students that what they're doing is being taken, that the information they're sharing is being taken seriously, and that they're going to continue to be informed. Now, once that campus climate survey closed, but before Tulane University was able to share the outcomes of the survey, there is that gap period. Institutions need to have a minute to be able to look at the data and, as just noted, figure out what it's saying and how it needs to be shared to the campus. So in between that point, they continued to have communication releases that shared how they were intending to use the information, that set expectations for when the campus climate survey information was going to be released. And then they shared the information and they shared updates about how they were planning to use the data going forward. You can see that all of this communication happened over a course of an entire year. So this is a beautiful example of keeping your campus informed about the data that you have, and setting that transparency expectation that your campus community is going to know the information as fast as you are able to share it, and that you're going to continue to include them in the ways in which that data is going to be used going forward. So this is how Tulane University framed their action plan for creating a prevention culture, which is how this is shared, and you can see this on their website. They talked about what their goal was. They talked about what efforts they've done so far. They talked about the new efforts that they would be starting. They shared how they were going to measure it, and together this is what they named as their path to change. Now I want to show you an example of what that looked like. So this is from a screenshot of their actual website, and you can see I've added this positive, inclusive, forward-looking tone, but you can see here from the information on the screen that they are calling in their campus community even as a part of sharing the data. So this is the website where they're sharing the information from their campus climate survey, and you can see that as a part of sharing that information, they're also simultaneously creating opportunities for students to be involved in, and faculty and staff to be involved in prevention efforts. And this is the magic, where you go from gathering data to that important point of implementing data to make evidence-informed strategic changes that are going to create that campus culture transformation that leads to greater safety and less harm for students on campus. Once you have data, if we don't use that data to implement strategies, programs, and other approaches, ongoing efforts, as we know that the vow amendments to the Clery Act ask of us, then the data doesn't actually do anything. You may mentally imagine the person on your campus whom I call the data smog, which is, if you've ever seen The Hobbit, there's a dragon that sits on top of a huge pile of gold, protecting it, making sure that no one else takes it. And if you have a smog on your campus who's sitting on top of your pile of data gold, you just need to make sure that you're sending the message that the data doesn't do anything until we use it to implement interventions, programs, and other strategies on our campus, and that we measure those for effectiveness and we report out those changes to our campus community. All right, so pardon me while I move forward all of these animations. I realized a little late in the game that they're a little hard for folks to see. Here we go. Okay, now we're here. So I want to give a spotlight to the University of Delaware, and this is related specifically to alcohol or other drug misuse prevention efforts. So of course the Clery data asks that we track alcohol violations as well. And this is a wonderful story. So the University of Delaware and the work of Nancy Chase and her colleagues in the health center at the University of Delaware through their efforts, they've actually also won Campus Prevention Network Impact Awards, both for their alcohol and other drug misuse prevention efforts as well as their sexual assault prevention efforts. But this is a great example about how University of Delaware, through their established forum, their Coalition for Alcohol and Other Drug Prevention, which was a campus-wide initiative that brought in many different members of their campus community to gather data, evidence, and other information in order to establish with that data in a systematic way what their forward movements were going to be in shaping and changing some of the policy, identifying the specific issue they were going to address on their campus and shaping the policies that are going to help make that campus transformation. So they took that information and they shared it with a campus working group and to create the communications working group strategic plan. Now this strategic plan was really about focusing in on the fact that their large-scale campus events and their high-risk drinking were significant factors that were impeding the success of students at the University of Delaware. And so from that information, they developed some policy guidelines and specifically created a high-risk events committee that targeted in on what their diagnostic efforts identified, which is that while there are high-risk drinking issues across the school year, there are specific times of year and specific events that are particularly problematic and that it would make the most impact on their binge drinking rates if they were to put efforts in place that would reduce the binge drinking around those high-risk events. So they had information about their high-risk drinking. They had information about connecting that high-risk drinking to specific events, and then they put in place, using that data, a targeted approach to reducing the binge drinking rates during those high-risk events. The outcome of that, as you can see, is that they saw a 15% decline in high-risk drinking between 2014 and 2017. And as we saw from Dr. Moylan's research, when we are reducing those binge drinking rates, we are also reducing the risks campus-wide related to sexual assault perpetration. So this is a powerful strategy, and University of Delaware really should be congratulated for this extraordinary work. Laura talked earlier about the way in which the annual security report gives us year-over-year data over a 3-year period. And I want to echo what she was saying as it relates to the importance of looking at trend data. So this is an example of the way in which trend data can help reveal changes in what can be common or, given information about a student campus. So what you see here, and this is all national data, so we're highlighting here data from our Alcohol EDU course for first-year students, and we're also highlighting here data from Monitoring the Future, which is a very long-running study out of the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research that's looking at a wide variety of factors that are impacting emerging adults and young adults. And so you can see from 1991 to 2018, the number of students who are saying that they've consumed no alcohol in the past year that has increased dramatically over this long period of time. These kinds of changes may not be visible in the 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, but when you're able to look at that year-over-year data, you're able to identify some more of these significant trends. And that for our first-year students and for our high-risk drinkers, that the number of non-drinkers on campus is increasing, and that the number of high-risk drinkers on our college campuses over a period of time is decreasing as well. So one thing that can be really valuable for your campus is to, when you take that year-over-year data, use that year-over-year data in combination with other kinds of longitudinal or long-term data, year-over-year data sets to help create a context or a framework to both understand your specific institution picture and how that institution picture aligns with what we're seeing on the national picture. This is an example of a way that you can do it with your own institution year-over-year data as well for alcohol, but this can also be done as it relates to sexual or gender-based violence as well. And I want to give you a spotlight to, last but not least, really share an important story about the way in which, even while it's very important to gather information related to prevalence, that we also need to be gathering information around healthy behaviors, because that can help us see a couple of different pieces. We want to be able to see the ways in which harmful behavior may be increasing or decreasing, or to get an accurate picture of it. But we also need to know information about healthy behavior. Why is that the case? Because we are not going to be able to put efforts in place that seek to capitalize upon or amplify those positive or healthy behaviors unless we have a clear understanding of what they are. Certainly, we need to be thinking both about how we decrease harmful efforts, but also how we do the promotion of the positive, which is an important strategy that the CDC has put their imprimatur behind over and over and over again. So this is the work from the University of Georgia. So Liz Prince and her team out of the Fontaine Center noticed in looking at their year-over-year data from their alcohol EDU course that they had positive trends in student drinking behavior. And those positive trends in student drinking behavior included both that students were drinking in less harmful ways, and they were drinking in less harmful ways more often, and that there were many more students who were making the determination that they were going to not consume alcohol at all in the past year, or that they were abstaining entirely. They identified as a part of the alcohol EDU survey that in fact they had 2,500 students who were interested in meeting others who didn't drink, and that they wanted to participate in alcohol-free activities. So with this data saying, look, we have a significant student population who is choosing not to consume alcohol, wants to be able to connect to others who are making that same decision, and want to be able to engage in fun campus activities where alcohol is not a part of the picture. They took that data to senior leadership across a number of departments with the message that we have compelling student story here. We have students who desire to engage in healthy behavior, and it's now our responsibility to create the infrastructure so that they continue to desire to engage in this healthy behavior. And so with this positive data, they were able to increase their budget significantly for those alcohol-free initiatives by collecting the data on those positive behaviors to be able to say, look, the story is a lot different than what you may believe, where we perhaps see so often the negative ramifications of the harmful drinking behavior. We're finding additional information about the healthy behavior that may be less visible to the leadership perspective. This is what our students are telling us, and this is the need that we have the opportunity to meet to be able to continue that positive behavior. So this is a great example both of the importance of gathering information about that healthy positive behavior, and also the way in which data can be used to create a compelling story for additional support of those prevention initiatives, including, in this case, alcohol-free initiatives. And I will go ahead and at this point turn it over to you, Laura.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Holly. I am going to take a big healthy pause just in case folks have any questions they don't want to forget about all of the great information you've been sharing with us. So I'm going to let folks do that. I'm going to talk a little bit right now, but it's nothing that's different than what Holly was just talking about. I just wanted to call out, Holly, how I really appreciate so much of the work that you're talking about that's being done on campuses and the strategies you're sharing is so accessible. They're brilliant ideas, but they're not overthought and they're not particularly complicated. Like, I particularly love that example that you share from Williams College of having students do such a concrete hands-on activity that gives such helpful data to the campus to understand, what does it mean when we see this increased incidence rate of unwanted touching happening in our social spaces. Here are factors that could be contributing to that. Can you evaluate for us what you would like to see? And it's such an interesting, creative way to address getting that information in a more detailed way. And I'm sure that students found it to be a really, I would assume an engaging process. And, they're asking us, our thoughts and opinions on this in such a, distinct and specific way that is easy for us to understand as well. I think reminding us that these approaches can be what may be thought of as quote-unquote simple, but that they still yield such significant results. Similar to what you were talking about, what was happening at Tulane. I mean, so often we hear the complaints from students or staff is that, at least what we hear when students call Clery to ask questions about what Clery requires is, quote, my campus is doing nothing. And so in reality, you just might need to be talking about what you are doing more frequently or in a way that makes more sense to the students. And so for that example that you gave with Tulane about the talking in between the administration of the survey, its completion, giving an update on how many people have responded or participated, I mean, it does really show a commitment to transparency, which I think is really what, in an age where information is so accessible, that is an expectation that people have in their daily life. So when you don't receive it in another capacity, it's questioned immediately as maybe suspicious, I guess. And so that just makes sense to me a lot. So I really appreciate all those things that you're highlighting for the audience today.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So folks, any questions that you have about anything that Holly has been sharing with us so far before we make some connections as to how you could use Clery data to inform change? I wanted to take a couple second pause rather to see if folks have questions. Okay, well, maybe not. Oh, wait, I see someone said, okay. So I knew as soon as I said something, someone would start typing. It is a reminder, too, we got the question, obviously, as you all saw through the group discussion, are these webinars going to be made available after today? And yes, they are recorded, and so they are available at no cost to folks through our NACSAM website, which is ncsam.clerycenter.org. This week's webinars will not be available until at the earliest next week, but beyond that, just let us know if you have any other questions. So when it comes to using Clery data to think about changes that you might want to implement and then how you could best communicate about those changes, we wanted to pose to you a couple of scenarios. So one of them here is, what if the Clery crime statistics within your annual security report show a rise in reports of stalking occurring within on-campus residence halls? And on top of that, the campus newspaper has picked up on this and is starting to report on that rise in reports. So, there might be replace stalking with any other type of Clery crime and replace on-campus newspaper with local newspaper. And I'm sure many of you have had a similar experience as to this scenario. So we would love to hear from you all if you could share your responses in the group discussion box. What, if anything, would you do in this situation? What have you maybe done in a similar situation? And what messages are you sending to hopefully bridge the gap in understanding that a rise in reported incidents does not necessarily constitute a problem per se? So would love to hear from you all as to your thoughts on how you would respond to this type of a situation or institution. So I see some folks are chiming in. I see some responses sharing that, for them, they would try to make a connection between the fact that an increase in reported incidents demonstrates, a trust in the reporting process at that institution, as well as a recognition of what behaviors might constitute stalking. So what you could maybe analyze from this is, was there any additional social norming campaign or information sharing that happened in a targeted way in the on-campus residence halls that maybe would support this increase in reporting? If so, could you take those strategies and measures and apply them to different contexts on campus, perhaps, with student groups on campus, or incorporate it into a first or second year experience course? Would that connection be able to be something that you could draw from? Similarly, could you share information via the campus newspaper, either in an editorial or in a story, about how increased numbers of reporting, doesn't necessarily strike us as a problem. It strikes us as a refreshing, confirmation that our reporting systems are in place and that people rely on them well and they know where to go to report. So any other thoughts that people have on this situation?
I was going to jump in there too, Laura, if that's okay. This is Jess. Say I think this is a really great example of a time to proactively engage media, in particular your student paper, because as we all know, if we don't go to them to try and use this to tell a story and provide education, then they're going to often just fill in the dots and cause, sometimes without having the information about why a rise in statistics might be a good thing for us, why it might indicate, increase in education. They might fill in the dots with another version of this story that I think can actually be harmful to a campus community. And so when I see a scenario like this, the first thing that comes to my mind is really like partnership, right? This is why we have teams that are sexual assault response teams or coordinated community response teams, so that these are times where I think it makes a lot of sense to get those folks around a table. Even so, to begin with, you can start as a team to make sense of why you might see this rise in numbers, so that you sort of collectively can share that information with the campus community and make sure that you're being really transparent about it. And to go back to Holly's point, I think this is a really good example of how you can sort of be proactive and transparent and use that data to educate the community versus waiting for people to just pay attention to it on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly on the other side of this too, while a rise in reports demonstrates possibly not necessarily all of a sudden an increase in the action of stalking, but a recognition of stalking behaviors and a reliance on a reporting system or reporting mechanisms, you also certainly do now have more stalking incidents than you thought you did in the previous year. And so how are you talking about responding to those types of incidents? How are you talking about stalking prevention? How, if anything, would you use this information to guide the type of programming that you're offering or where you're offering it? Or if you think that you did that successfully around stalking and that got the change that you wish to see, are you going to target your efforts now around perhaps dating violence in a different way? Are you talking about the co-occurrence of stalking with other gender-based misconduct actions? Are you talking about how individuals, once they report that they've been a survivor of stalking, how they could help be a part of future prevention programming efforts if they wanted to? Like just all of the things that Jess is talking about around partnership is so important to remember here.
And somebody just jumped in about a change in law, and I think that's a really good point because we're all dealing with that right now, right? Whether it's changes in state legislation or in federal mandates around reporting. And so you're right, as those things change and as our mandated reporting or our requirements change, then that's going to impact numbers too, right? That's going to impact our statistics. But again, your campus community might not be paying a lot of attention to that. So how do you proactively sort of communicate that to the campus so that when they start to see some of those changes represented in numbers, they understand why?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And, it's also helpful, too, like we keep saying, that data tells a story, and we want to help, you want to help fill in the blanks to tell that right story. And so when you even do publish your annual security report, there's a reason why you're required to talk about both statistics and summaries of existing policies and procedures, because it's not just enough to give people the numbers. People want to know, what do you do about this situation? How do you prevent and respond to these types of incidents? And even further, if there was ever a significant change in your Clery statistics that you wanted to account for or provide context for, there is absolutely nothing that prevents you from doing that within your annual security report. So many campuses do provide caveats or footnotes around their statistics to indicate why there might be a change in numbers, why there might be a spike or a decrease, what constitutes each of their categories of Clery geography, so that community members that are reading the ASR more clearly understand where that information is applying to, and all those sorts of things. So you're definitely able to use those types of tools as well. So then let's take it on the other end. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to jump in one example here. When I was at the University of Michigan, one of the things that the annual security report always included was data of reports that had come into the confidential crisis lines and other confidential reporting mechanisms, so that as the institution was presenting information about instances that had been reported and that were clearly reportable, they were also providing a broader picture of the kinds of information that we knew about as well. And I think that sharing those kinds of data reflects to the campus community that you understand that as it relates to prevalence, that this is a complex picture and that we need to bring in many different kinds of data streams to have a full understanding.
Yeah, thank you so much, Holly. That's super helpful. I see we just had another question come in too. What's the best way to keep up to date with changing laws, both federally and within your state, in relation to Clery reporting? So this is a really timely and helpful question, and I certainly can understand the need to ask this question because it probably feels like information overload sometimes when it comes to changing laws. What I will say is that Clery is, you will know definitively when there is a change to what you need to report under Clery, as it is a federal law and there are so many campuses that are expected to be required to uphold it. Clery Center, for one, would always be a great place and source of information for any changes to what crimes you need to count under Clery. There has not been a change to Clery reporting since the VAWA amendments, which added the 3 crimes of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking to the list of Clery crimes. And that was back in 2013, went into effect in 2015. So as you can see, it's 4 years since that went into effect. So it's not like Clery reporting requirements are changing all that frequently right now. Certainly what's on the docket for a possible change to Clery is the addition of hazing as a Clery crime. But that is still very much in its infancy stages because it's just been an idea that's been proposed through proposed legislation. It has not been necessarily passed into law yet. One thing that is really, and Jess, feel free to jump in to explain this because I know this is definitely something we're all talking about a lot right now, but the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act is what is, hinging on many possible changes to Clery or other types of laws that are connected to higher education. And so there is a little bit of a stalemate right now in terms of those changes being made. Jeff, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that any further at this point.
Well, I just want to answer the question of what's the best way to keep up, because I chuckled a little bit when I saw that because I was like, I don't know, let me know when you find out, because there's no easy way, right? But I think some of the suggestions I would make is there is somebody on your campus who has to be keeping up to date, right? It's probably someone in your Office of General Counsel, or maybe somebody in your government relations, or even if you're in small school, maybe it's someone in the president's office. Like, there is somebody who's always going to have their finger on the pulse of that. So I would say find out who that person is, and have a relationship with them, or at least let them know that it's something that you want to be informed of. Another thing is to look to some of the national organizations, I would say, that are trying to keep track of that. Sometimes it's harder for them to keep track of the state legislation, but are certainly trying to update people around the federal legislation. So organizations like NASPA, who have a policy arm now, they've just actually posted a blog about some of the updates of the hazing legislation. They've been a helpful resource for us. The American Council on Education also posts updates. So I think, it's not a realistic expectation to think that you individually are always going to be able to keep up with that, but I would say find the people who are and try and tap into that. it's also, if you're in an office where you have student interns or student workers, it's a great project I have found to give students to, especially if you have students interested in policy and legislation, having them sort of keep their finger on the pulse too and report back on that.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks so much, Jess. With the few minutes that we have left, I just wanted to touch on this last other example as well. So say you had a scenario that was the converse of the previous example. So say you had little to no reports of hate crimes to your public safety department or your campus police department. So some things that you might want to consider doing to increase that, because what that might demonstrate is not necessarily that hate crimes aren't happening at your campus. Unfortunately, they probably are, but there might be a lack of awareness of what would constitute something that is a hate crime. There might be a lack of trust in the reporting processes or mechanisms in place, because there might be a lack of assurance that something will be done in response to a report of one of those types of crimes. And so this kind of goes back to the example Holly was talking about, I think it was Tulane University, where just their increased messaging and communication while administering the campus climate survey, and then once it closed, helped to communicate to the campus that they are invested in sharing the results of that survey with the campus, and they're also invested then in understanding what to change as a result of the information they learned from the survey. And so this is a similar example of the more you open lines of communication between administration and the campus community about things like what would qualify as a violation of your institution's bias incident policy, or what a hate crime under Clery is, and how those two things might be different, and how you want everything reported anyway, because for, messaging in these areas is extremely important. But not necessarily just messaging in one capacity. We all know that exposure to a message repeated over time is going to be more beneficial for folks to internalize that message, and then sharing that message in a variety of formats is going to be most successful in making sure it reaches the widest amount of people, and there are multiple touch points per person. So when you're thinking about how do we describe to the campus, what a bias incident policy violation is at our school, if you only talk about that in the policy that you publish in your student handbook, and you never talk about it in any other capacity, then that message might get lost on your campus community. So are you doing, social norming campaigns? Are you talking with or partnering with organizations on your campus that do in-person programming or that offer online messaging through social media channels? Are you partnering with student government to have them share your message through the channels that they use? Are you working with staff on campus to get into new employee orientation to talk about things like this? It's really helpful to just think about the ways that you can reinforce the message that you want to communicate. We talk here about some passive and active programming ideas, and then often it just is that repeated exposure to messages. So the more that you can include in your standard presentations that you give, information on the topic area that you want to see a change in, the more helpful it can be to stress how this information is something that you value at your institution, and you want to make sure that you're connecting the dots for those folks. So those are just two small examples of how Clery connects to this concept. I know we're approaching the end of our time here, so we want to both thank you all so much for attending. Thank you so much, Holly, for the information you shared. Again, a recording of this webinar will be available through the NACSAM website as early as next week. And if you wouldn't mind, before you left today, if you could please take our survey, that the link to the survey was just included in the group discussion pod. We really appreciate all feedback on the webinars that take place, especially at NACSAM. And if you have any ideas for what you would like to see as part of NACSAM 2020, do not hesitate to let us know either in the survey or by emailing me directly as well, and I can put my contact information in the pod also. So thank you all so much. Holly, thank you so much. And Jess, thank you so much for being a part of our webinar today. If you do have any questions that did not get answered, please feel free to reach out to me directly. And if they apply to something that Holly was speaking about or Jess is speaking about, I can make sure to get those questions to them as well. Holly and Jess, any parting words, or Cheryl, any parting words before we close out?
My only parting word would be to get in there and look at your data, and don't be afraid to give it a try.
Awesome.
I think I'm at a love like now, Holly, so congrats. I hope you all are too.
Yes, I think it's fair to say all the way around. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and please join us for our remaining NACSAM webinars.